Alvin York has got to be one of the most badass heroes of World War I, specifically that fought in the US Army. And it is for those actions that he received his own Medal of Honor after the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918. Over the course of the attack, he led just a small group of men, and yet still managed to capture 130 prisoners of war, while simultaneously taking out multiple machine gun posts. But see, it wasn't always this way. Alvin York, when he was born, was merely one of 11 children. Specifically, he was the third eldest. And yet, despite there being 11 children, his entire family grew up in a small cabin in rural Tennessee. And being such a large family in a poor environment, well, they needed a lot of help around the house. Specifically, in order to provide food, he became a crack shot, very adept at hunting. And though he lacked any kind of formal education, he gained much skill with his hands, working on the farm, or, in general, hunting, able to provide food for his family. But unfortunately for York, in 1911, when his father died, he, as the eldest that was still living there in his family, well, he had to go to work. And so to support his family and to help raise his siblings, he went and actually became a railroad construction worker. But of course, being a blue-collar worker in rural Tennessee is one that typically is going to incline oneself towards certain habits. York did become a heavy drinker. He got heavily involved in fights, and a multitude of other problems ensued. This, of course, being despite pleas from his mother, who was continuously begging him to please avoid such a rough-and-tumble lifestyle. But he didn't want to listen. This continued for years until 1914, when his friend Everett Delk was actually beaten to death in a brawl in Stanton, Kentucky. And at that point, he was scared. He didn't want to end up like his friend. Shaken by this incident, York actually went on to attend a revival meeting that was led by a man by the name of H.H. Russell, during which he concluded that he needed to change his ways or else he was going to end up just like his friend Delk. And so, altering his behavior, he became a member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union, which, this, to explain, was a strict fundamentalist sect, something where the church forbade violence, forbade drinking, dancing, gambling, essentially anything that some may deem to be fun, or in this case was just more common in the popular culture. And it is actually while being a member of this congregation that he would go on to meet his wife, or future wife, Gracie Williams, specifically while teaching Sunday school at the church. But when the United States entered World War I, he and many others became concerned that they were going to be drafted into World War I, which ultimately, in the end, would happen. At first, it was merely volunteers, but the war itself was not necessarily popular for young people to go into, and as a result, a draft ensued. Those worried of his, they became reality when he got called up for the draft. So, in order to try and combat this, he consulted his priest to try and figure out what it is that he would need to do. And his priest advised him that if he was going to try and avoid the draft, he needed to sign up as a conscientious objector and refuse the draft, which he did. Although his reason was put as doesn't want to fight, not religious obligations. And so when his case was actually reviewed by the local and state draft authorities, his request was denied because his church, this Christian Union, was actually a newer church. It wasn't something that was developed to the point that it was widely accepted by the public. And being a member of a non-recognized Christian sect meant that, well, he was going to get drafted. But one of the things that the US Army actually did here in the early days of the war is that if you had a conscientious objector who had religious reasonings for not wanting to fight, they could still be drafted, but they would be put into a non-combat role. In his case, no, he was going to be sent to the infantry. And so now, at the age of 30 years old, York was assigned to Company G of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, and posted to Camp Gordon in Georgia. And after arriving, he did prove to be a very crack shot, one where his hunting skills from the previous years, they came in handy. But it was weird for the rest of the unit because he didn't want to fight. Despite having all these skills, all these abilities, he didn't want to actually be there. And so during this time, he had extensive conversations with his company commander, Captain Edward C.B. Danforth, and his battalion commander, Major G. Edward Buxton. And they tried to relate to him the justifications in the Bible for war. Something that, to this day, is still a contentious subject among people who are deeply religious. See, Buxton himself was a rather devout Christian, and so he tried everything that he could to cite passages in the Bible where he could relate to York the necessity for violence, for what was needed to be done and for a greater cause. And so as a devout Christian, Buxton actually cited a variety of biblical sources in order to counter his subordinates' concerns. Challenging York's pacifist stance, the two officers were able to convince over time that war could be justified. Following a 10-day leave to visit home, York returned with a firm belief that God had actually called him to fight. And so, traveling to Boston, York's unit would sail for Le Havre, France on May 1918, and would arrive later that month after a stop in Britain. Reaching the continent, York's division would spend time training the Somme, as well as Toul, Ligny, and Marbache, where they underwent a variety of training in order to prepare them for combat operations along the Western Front. At this point, York was promoted to corporal and took part in the Saint-Mihiel offensive, where he would help to protect the US Army's right flank in the upcoming offensives. And with the successful conclusion of that fighting in the sector, the 82nd would go on to shift northward in order to take part in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Entering the fight on October 7th in order to relieve the units of the 28th Division Infantry, York's unit received orders that night that they were to advance the next morning and take Hill 223, and from there, press on to sever the Deaconville Railroad that was north of Châtel-Charest. Advancing around 6 a.m. that next morning, the Americans would succeed in taking the hill. But it was when they were moving forward from the hill that York's unit was forced to attack through a triangular valley, and they very quickly came under fire from German machine guns, ones that were actually located on both sides of the adjacent hills. Very quickly, this managed to stall the attack, and the Americans were, again, quickly racking up the casualties. And so in an effort to eliminate the machine guns, 17 men led by Sergeant Bernard Early, including York, were ordered to work around into the German rear. And so taking advantage of the brush and the hilly terrain, these American troops actually managed to succeed, making their way ahead up the hill of the American advance. And when they did so, and they made this advance, they actually managed to come across a German headquarters and take many prisoners, including, notably, a German major. But while Early's men began securing these prisoners, the German machine gunners that were further up the slope turned several of their guns on them and opened fire on the Americans. This almost immediately would kill 6 men and would wound 3, including Early. And so at that point, as the next person in rank, York would go on to lead the remaining 7 men. And so with his men behind him covering the prisoners, York himself moved up in order to take out these machine guns. Going into a prone position, he utilized the shooting skills that he had honed as a boy. Picking off the German gunners one by one, York was able to move to a standing position as he evaded enemy fire. Over the course of this fight, 6 German soldiers would emerge from their trenches and charge at York with bayonets. Running low on rifle ammunition, he drew his pistol and dropped all 6 before they reached him. Switching back to his rifle, he returned to sniping at the German machine guns. Believing, at this point, that he'd killed around 20 soldiers with no more wish to kill more, he began to call out to the enemy, begging them to please surrender. And at first, the Germans refused. But York in this case was aided by that major that he had captured earlier. The German commander himself called out, telling these men, please surrender. And they did. After rounding up all of the men in the area that they had managed to capture and doing a head count, they figured that they had captured somewhere along the lines of 100 men. And so with the major's assistance, York gradually began to move the German prisoners back to the American lines, where over the course of that march, he would go on to capture 30 more men himself. Advancing through the artillery fire, York would bring him and his men as well as the prisoners back to headquarters, bringing with them 132 prisoners. This done, he and his men rejoined their unit and fought through to Deaconville Railroad. And in the course of the fight, 28 Germans would be killed, 35 machine guns captured. York's actions in clearing the machine guns would reinvigorate the 328th's assault, and the regiment would advance to secure a position on Deaconville Railroad. And this was insane. For his achievements, York was immediately promoted to sergeant. Though he did receive the Distinguished Service Cross, he remained with his unit in the final weeks of the war, and his decoration was actually upgraded to the Medal of Honor, which he received on April 18, 1919. The award was presented to York by the American Expeditionary Forces commander, General John J. Pershing. And in addition to the Medal of Honor, he also received the French Croix de Guerre, the Legion of Honor, as well as the Italian Croce de Merito de Guerra. Dear God, that honestly sounds probably bad, me saying that.
You did your best.
Thank you. And when given his French decorations by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander commented, "What you did was the greatest thing ever accomplished by any soldier by any of the armies in Europe." And arriving back in the United States in late May, York was hailed as a hero and given his own parade. Though he was wooed by filmmakers and advertisers, York was very eager to return home, to his family, and to his farm. Doing so, he went on to marry Gracie Williams that June, and over the next several years, the couple would have 10 children, 8 of whom would manage to survive infancy. As a celebrity, York would take part in several speaking tours, and he eagerly sought to improve the educational opportunities for the children of his native state and region in Tennessee. And this would actually culminate with the opening of the Alvin C. York Institute in 1926, which would later be taken over by the state of Tennessee in 1937. Although York did possess some forms of political ambitions, these ultimately didn't really come to much. And over the years, he actually ran into quite a bit of financial issues, until eventually, in 1941, he relented to the people who were constantly hounding him for interviews and movie deals, and he did accept someone going and creating a movie about his life. Initially, this movie was supposed to be nothing more than about his work helping to educate area children in Tennessee, but very quickly, in 1941, it became about promoting American intervention in World War II. Which is not to say that that is necessarily something that upset York. In the beginning, he was very opposed to American involvement in World War II, but after Pearl Harbor, he and many others became avid proponents. And so with America's entry into the war, Alvin did actually attempt to re-enlist, but with his age, as well as his weight, at the time he was essentially diabetic, there was really no way that he could go in and fight. Instead, they did allow him to join the military, but not as an enlisted soldier. Instead, he would go around doing tours, educating the population, and helping drum up support for the American war effort. Things, after the war, settled down for York. He still had a lot of financial troubles, and going into the 50s, he suffered from a stroke, before ultimately passing away in 1964. In the end, Alvin York was a hero, and was well beloved by his community and family, and his story is one of the greatest that could ever be told. And with that, I think that we are going to end things here today. I do hope that you enjoyed this little historical biography on a badass figure, and please let me know what it is that you would like to see next for other badass figures. I hope to make this a recurring series along with alternate history and gaming videos. If there's anything that you all do want to see, let me know in the comments below. Please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell button for notifications, and I hope to see you all here again soon. Thank you all, and goodbye.